Oh, thank you, Dame Siobhan. It's a pleasure to hold this debate with you in the chair. And I beg to move that this House has considered the adequacy of planning policy for travellers' sites. Now, my constituents are very reasonable people. They totally understand and appreciate people's wanting to live different ways of life, alternative ways of life, including nomadic lifestyles. And certainly in my constituency, where I've lived all my life, the travelling community has been part of that constituency for that whole period of time. And we very much respect the contribution they make to our society. Of course, as long as, of course, the communities are law-binding and let other people go about have the peaceful enjoyment of their property and their settlements and communities. What their concern is, and the real concerns in my constituency about a number of different planning applications, is that the planning policies apply equally to local people as to other communities, including travelling communities. The basic principle that there is one law for all of us, rather than one law for one person, another for another person, and that the law applies equally to everyone in our communities and our society. And I think there's a real feeling in some of these applications that that is not the case. And it contributes to the feeling, perhaps in our society is moving to a form of two-tier society, and that would be a very, very dangerous state of affairs. I think it's fair to say, in some of the communities where these applications are being made, that our local communities don't understand why it is that planning policy is not overseen equally, and indeed a deal of anger about that particular situation. So we've got a number of applications, one at Sheriff Hutton in my constituency, one near Rillington, and a number of potential other ones where these situations are occurring. And these applications are being considered and in some cases recommended for approval on the basis of not planning law, but other laws, such as the Human Rights Act, Equalities Act, and UN Convention for the Rights of the Child, and indeed the European Convention of Human Rights, which obviously is having other consequences in different parts of our system. So normal law-abiding citizens go about a planning application in the appropriate way. The first thing they do is find a site that may suit their needs, of course. Then look at planning policy and probably instruct an agent to look after that on their behalf. Submit an application before doing any work to that site. But submit an application that must conform to planning policy, otherwise they will not get consent for that application, and go through the various iterations that a planning process takes, which may take years to get that planning consent, and hopefully at some point through that process they get consent for the property development they're looking to do. So most of my constituents respect the planning process and the outcomes of that process. Very happy to give way to my honourable friend.
Madam Chair, can I first of all apologise to you, Madam Chair, and to the honourable gentleman as well. I can't stay of other engagements and try and fit them all in. I apologise for that. But I did wish to speak in this. Does the honourable member agree that we need to ensure that all policies that pertain to allowing travellers to carry on their way of life without adversely affecting the community around them, and this very delicate balance that has to be struck is not simply in planning policy alone, but also in all policies. We want, I believe, the foster traveller communities that feel engaged and a part of our communities. And I do believe that this can be achieved by building relationships and just with a little bit of understanding. Does he agree?
You know, as always, he is very reasonable, and I think that's exactly the position my constituents take, and I take. It's about fairness, but also applying the law equally. And that's looking at the Human Rights Act, there is a requirement to treat, not just to consider the rights of the individual, but the rights of other people in that situation. And that's very clear, but it seems to be that some of these applications are being considered, giving the applicants giving greater consideration than the rights of others. And that's my biggest concern. I mean, this has been dealt with to some extent through planning policy, but I don't think sufficiently to deal with some of these problems we are seeing. So I set out how a law-abiding, somebody who respects the law and the planning process might set about applying for planning permission. What is happening in some of these applications, this has not been done that way around. what's happening is some of these applicants are purchasing a site, first of all, probably a roadside site, with access or without access, creating an access, and these sites are, this site in Sherry Futton and in Rillington is in open countryside, is not in a location you would normally get planning consent for this kind of development. What happens then is the site is prepared, the access, hard standing, for example, which is not a major contravention of planning policy, not something the planning department may have too big a problem with at that point in time. There may be an agricultural building on that site, for example, and there may be water and power put into this site. A preparation occurs. And then one evening, overnight, or at a bank holiday weekend, when the people who are supposed to look after these matters may not be in their office, that site is occupied without planning consent in a way that is unlawful. So it may be caravans move onto that site, other equipment, maybe toilet blocks are built overnight. This is certainly what happened on one of the sites, and that site is occupied with a view to that site being occupied permanently. This is not a temporary position. The people who are occupying that site intend to occupy it permanently. Of course, then, the planning authority has to go through an enforcement process, one that's happened, local complaints from local people about the application, and then the planning authority will, the wheels turn pretty slowly, which I think the people who are occupying the site are aware of that, and enforcement measures are taking place. And this may take a matter of months, of course, and which then, say, the community may have experienced some disturbance and some real concerns are expressed by local communities at that point in time. When enforcement measures take place, the occupant of that land, the owner of that land, will then submit an application, a planning application, retrospectively. Despite there being a flagrant breach of proper planning process, that application is then considered as if it was, if the application was made using the proper process. And I think that's fundamentally what goes wrong here. The fact that the retrospective application is considered on the same grounds as if it was a normal, lawful process, that is what is wrong. And when the application is made, of course, the application is made on the basis of the rights of the people occupying that site. So often the Human Rights Act is quoted, the Equality Act of 2010 is quoted, the UN Convention of the Child, the European Convention of Human Rights, all these things are quoted for the rights of the occupants, generally the families of that particular site. And their needs, of course, things like healthcare and education. And no one would doubt the needs of the children on those sites, for example, or people in need of healthcare accessing those kind of facilities. But those are all the basis of the application, why this application should be considered, despite the fact it is retrospective. Yes, of course.
First of all, Manager, can I thank the Honourable for being so gracious and for giving a second intervention. Is he aware of the latest Irish Travellers Accommodation Strategy 2020-2025? If the Honourable Member isn't, or the Minister isn't, could I suggest that perhaps maybe access should be made for that? Because it does, I think, set out guidelines to provide Irish travellers, in this case, with access to good quality, culturally appropriate housing accommodation which fosters a sustainable, vibrant travelling community. That allows the travellers to enjoy their own lifestyle, but at the same time consider the possibility of integration. Does he agree that perhaps that guideline, which is from a different jurisdiction, but the guidelines may be helpful?
Well, perhaps understandably, this is not actually my policy area. I'm holding this debate on the basis that it's a particular constituency issue, but so I'm not particularly aware of the Irish rules in terms of those he quotes. But it's absolutely right to say that local planning authorities have a requirement to facilitate the peaceful enjoyment of people who live nomadic lifestyles, and I support that totally. And North Yorkshire should provide those kind of facilities, and they do. This site is occupied despite the fact there are available places on a specified, designated traveller site nearby, and that's one of the concerns. There are other facilities available, yet this particular application is based upon somebody who doesn't want to be on that site and wants to be somewhere else, and then I believe is misusing the planning policy in the right. That's my point about this. I have any objection It's people's right to live alternative lifestyles and to live in different ways and in their own communities. What I object to is misuse of the planning process. Now, this was dealt with to some extent by my very fine colleague, and sadly late colleague, James Brokenshire, back in when he was Housing Secretary. Back in February 2019, he published some new recommendations to planning authorities which did say that the intentional, unauthorised development of a site should be considered as a material point within a planning application, which I think this is absolutely critical. He was saying, therefore, that that should give a local planning authority grounds to refuse an application on the basis that this, there was an intentional, unauthorised development. So I think that's critical. The issue with this, of course, despite that requirement, and despite North Yorkshire, the local planning authority have been aware of that requirement, still, on this site, recommended approval, which I find astounding. So, and I find this whole situation astounding, and so do many of my constituents. And, you know, I think it's very important we look at the facts, and people engaged in this debate, or people perhaps watching this on Parliament TV, can look at this particular application if they go to the North Yorkshire portal. Number 22-00102 FUL is the planning reference. But all this, everything I'm saying here is not based upon just local rumours, local concerns, all about the actual documented situation with this planning application. The particular site in question, that site, is on Cornborough Road off Sheriff Hutton. It's a half a mile out of the village of Sheriff Hutton. It is in open countryside. It is outside the development plan. The application is for 8 units of accommodation, 4 permanent units, probably brick-built units or breeze block-built units, as well as permanent static caravans on that site, and also 12 car spaces. It's been occupied now for 3 years without planning consent. A family with 6 children, and obviously we respect the rights of that family to go about their lives in a way they would feel appropriate, and we have every hope those children will be properly educated and receive proper public services. But the planning authority, in their wisdom, the planning officers, decided to recommend for approval this particular site. They made one condition on that, one significant condition, is that occupancy of the site was to be restricted to the family and their dependents. So both the adults on that site, the owners of the site, and their children. And of course, those children could be adults one day, and that would mean that site could be occupied for many decades, of course. And also, as it says in the application, there could be a variation of application for an extended family, for example, or other variation, which could mean that site would be occupied for a very, very, very long time. Interestingly, remarkably, I think, the agent for the applicant, upon that, objected to that condition, again on human rights grounds. So it's very clear this site will be occupied permanently in the very long term, and have the ability to sell this site on to someone else. I think that's absolutely wrong, that you can effectively drive a coach and horses through the planning system. My constituents, my law-abiding constituents would not go about it in that way. And I think unless we deal with this properly, this will breed that sense of unfairness, and there are factors, a law for one and a law for another. I think unless we deal with this to make sure that anybody who is guilty of a flagrant abuse of the planning system cannot ever get planning consent on a site in this way, unless we clarify the planning guidance around that particular measure, I think we will see more and more of these applications, not just in my constituency, but in constituencies around the country. And I think I really urge the Minister, and I know he's fresh into his job, and I welcome him to his place. He's a very good man, and we've dealt with many things in the past when our roles are reversed. So I know he'll look at this very seriously. We've engaged on this particular matter already, as I have my colleague, the Shadow Minister, who again is a great experience in these matters. But I really think we need to tighten the rules here to make sure our constituents, the citizens, the law-abiding law-abiding citizens of this country feel we're on their side, the side of the law-abiding people who go about the process properly, and we don't favour people because of quite abstract laws or laws that potentially imposed upon us by the UN Convention of the Child or European Convention of Human Rights, which is now embedded within our own Human Rights Act. That means some people are treated more fairly than others through the process. I think it's very important we act, and very important we clarify the planning process, so people who act in this way can never get planning consent, because that is the only way we'll stop these kind of applications, these rogue applications, being submitted. Thank you.